Hey there, night traveler. Before we begin, a soft reminder. If your curiosity has ever wandered into candlelit corners of forgotten temples or lingered on the strange shimmer of a pharaoh's gaze from behind a golden mask, you're in the right place. If you enjoy stories where history leans close, lowers its voice, and tells you something it probably shouldn't, then maybe take a moment to subscribe. And while you're settling in, leave your local time and country in the comments. It's oddly comforting to see where other dreamers drift. Now, dim the lights, loosen your grip on the day, and breathe. The sand falls, grain by grain, a slow, silent rain upon the ruins of empires. Can you hear it? That soft, ceaseless sigh, the desert exhaling secrets older than memory. Imagine you are standing at the edge of the Nile. Not the tourist Nile, no cruise boats, no cameras, but the eternal Nile. A ribbon of midnight silk winding through a kingdom that believed gods walked among men. The sky above is vast and velvet, pierced by stars so clear they feel like they could cut you. In the distance, colossal statues cracked but proud gaze out toward eternity. Not one of them smiles. Not one of them blinks. A breeze curls past dry and perfumed. Lotus, crushed papyrus, the faint musk of embalming oils. You're not alone here, but you're not quite among the living either. We begin tonight, not with battles, nor with builders, not with pharaohs conquering lands, but with something far more forbidden, their bodies. In ancient Egypt, the flesh of the pharaoh was not just royal, it was divine. The touch of a god, the seed of a nation, the bridge between heaven and earth. Desire, you see, was sacred. Sex was ritual. Every union, every breath, every sweat-stained linen could ripple through the cosmos. This was a world where a king's virility wasn't just gossip, it was statecraft. A place where incense curled like prayers toward ceilings, painted with stars, and even the most intimate acts were documented in papyrus scrolls and stone murals, though sometimes only in symbols. But don't worry, we'll decode those too. Tonight, you'll walk the cool marble floors of harem chambers gilded in secrecy. You'll peer through sheer curtains into the private world of god-kings, where marriages were negotiations, pleasure was performance, and even jealousy had an official protocol. You'll meet queens whose wombs decided dynasties, dancers whose steps shaped the rain, priests who chanted blessings over wedding beds, and midwives who bore witness to more than just birth. Some stories are scandalous, some are quietly tragic, others are so strange you'll think we made them up. We didn't. This is not a tale of love as we know it. It is a story of sacred obligation, of ritualized desire, of bodies offered not just in passion, but in service to the gods, the kingdom, and the stars above. Behind the gold masks and feathered fans, there was sweat. There were doubts. There was longing. Even gods, it seems, grew tired. So pull the linen tight around your shoulders. Let the flicker of 1,000 ancient oil lamps light our way, and listen closely, dear sleeper. The sand is speaking, and the story is only just beginning. In a chamber carved from cool alabaster and perfumed with resin and fig smoke, a woman groaned beneath layers of linen and prophecy. Her eyes lined in kohl and shadowed by exhaustion stared upward toward a painted ceiling blue as the deepest sky strewn with golden stars. She was not just a mother. She was a vessel. Around her, priestesses whispered invocations under their breath, some for protection, others to remind the gods they were being watched. Midwives moved like shadows, practiced hands smeared with oil in anticipation. Outside the temple, drums slowed their rhythm until they stopped completely. And then he came, not in a rush of pain, but like a shift in the air. Not wailing, not gasping, just presence, as if something had been returned rather than born. In ancient Egypt, royal birth was not biology, it was cosmology. To be born, Pharaoh, was not to be a baby. It was to be a god made flesh. And the omens, oh the omens. That week, the Nile had risen one finger's breadth higher than expected. 3 ibis birds circled the sun at midday. A cow gave birth to twins, and one had a crescent-shaped mark above its eye. The scribes etched it all down on papyrus with calm hands and racing hearts. A divine child had arrived. Or a cursed one. Sometimes it was difficult to tell the difference. He was wrapped in linen soaked in myrrh and mother's milk. Held aloft, not by his mother, no, she was resting behind curtains, but by a priest in leopard skin, who chanted the names: Horus of the horizon, son of Ra, he who shall strike his enemies, beloved of Maat, a god in miniature, a promise in swaddling cloth. They placed him on a small altar beside a mirror of polished bronze, so that the first thing he saw was not the human world, but his own reflection, God recognizing God. From the moment of birth, the child Pharaoh was fed ritual as much as milk. Each suckle, a pact. Each nap, a rehearsal for eternity. Scribes recorded his sleep patterns, the shape of his ears, the exact timing of his first laugh. Nothing was trivial. A freckle might be an omen. A sneeze could signal divine displeasure. Astrologers consulted the stars and noted his constellation. The priests gathered the dust from beneath his crib and placed it in an urn to be buried in sacred ground, so even his cast-off skin cells could be protected from evil. He would never be touched casually, never scolded, never allowed to cry too long. His body did not belong to him. It belonged to the gods, to the state, to the myth of unbroken rule. He was watched not with affection, but with reverence and suspicion. You must understand. In Egypt, the pharaoh was the axis on which the world turned. His health, his seed, his dreams all echoed through the crops, the weather, the wars. If he coughed, the river might flood. If he smiled, the harvest would come early. If he failed to father children, the stars might fall from the sky. So when he was a newborn, soft, wrinkled, utterly mortal, they called him immortal anyway, and hoped the gods wouldn't notice the lie. In a hidden scroll, kept in a cedar box, a priest once wrote, "To touch the pharaoh is to touch the sun, but the sun burns. And sometimes it does not rise. Outside, the wind blew gently across the palace roof. Date palms rustled. A dog barked, once then fell silent. Inside, the infant god slept, breath shallow, hands curled, the weight of dynasties already resting lightly on his chest. And somewhere in a distant chamber, a midwife washed her hands, quietly, reverently, as if rinsing history from her fingers. The body of a pharaoh was not flesh in the way ours is. It was a map, a sacred vessel etched with invisible lines that connected the Nile to the stars, the seasons to the gods, life to death. From the moment of birth, his skin was oiled daily with scented unguents, frankincense to purify lotus, to soften cedar, to shield him from corruption. Priests would rub his tiny arms and legs as if polishing an idol chanting low rhythmic prayers. Because in their eyes, the pharaoh's body wasn't just his, it was Egypt's sacred flesh. It sounds poetic, but in Egypt, it was terrifyingly literal. A pharaoh's strength was believed to sustain the balance of the cosmos, Ma'at, the eternal order of truth, justice, and harmony. If his blood was weak, if his body failed, the crops might wither, the Nile might sulk in its banks, and the desert might creep in like a living enemy. So his body became a kind of national obsession. The palace physicians tracked his every breath. Even his daily meals were ritualistic honeyed dates for vitality beer, mixed with herbs for fertility meat, marinated in wine and prayers to feed the god within the man. And his sexuality, that wasn't private. It was cosmic duty. The king's seed was believed to fertilize not just wombs, but the very soil of Egypt. In some ancient festivals, priests performed symbolic unions between the pharaoh and the goddess of fertility, reenacted through statues and hymns. It was said that when the king lay with his queen or his concubines, the gods themselves watched, whispering approval or judgment through the rustle of linen curtains. If the king was vigorous, the kingdom flourished. If he faltered, well, the whispers began. Imagine it. You're a young pharaoh, barely 17. You wake under sheets embroidered with lapis and gold. But before you can eat or breathe, the high priest is already at your side, reciting the duties of your flesh. Your body is the bridge, he says. Your pleasure is our harvest. You are expected to be both a man and a myth. Desired, but untouchable. A god, but also a prisoner of your own perfection. And so the royal harem existed, not merely as a court of lovers, but as a ritual engine. Women were chosen not just for beauty, but for what their union with the pharaoh symbolized: peace treaties, fertility blessings, divine reenactments of gods like Isis and Osiris. Even private intimacy was steeped in ceremony. Fragrant oils, soft hymns, the rhythmic beating of sistrums. Nothing was simple. Nothing was personal. There are whispers in old scrolls about moments of fear, times when a king's body failed him, when impotence was seen not as a private sorrow, but as a cosmic crisis. Priests would scramble for solutions, elixirs of figs and honey prayers, whispered into the night secret rituals involving the blood of bulls and the breath of virgins. And if these remedies failed the pharaoh's masculinity, his godhood could be questioned. And in Egypt, a god who failed was no god at all. But here's the strange thing. Even with all this divine pressure, the pharaoh's body was also deeply human. It ached. It bled. It grew tired. The difference was that no one dared say it. Instead, they painted his muscles in murals as flawless curves of ochre and gold. They carved his jawline into statues that would outlast mountains. And they wrote, again and again, he is strong as Horus, eternal as Ra, fertile as the flood of the Nile. So the pharaoh became two beings, the man with doubts, hunger, fleeting desires, and the myth, an unbroken line of power, polished until it blinded everyone who looked too closely. And somewhere, in the quiet of the palace, under the heavy perfume of myrrh, you wonder if he ever whispered to himself just once, I am only human. The royal harem was not a room. It was a world. A kingdom within a kingdom, tucked behind high walls and lattice windows, where time moved not by sun or calendar, but by whispers, glances, and the rhythm of a single man's desire. From the outside, it appeared serene white stone corridors, lined with palm trees, perfumed gardens, watered by hand-soft sandals gliding over marble floors. But serenity here was an illusion, a defense mechanism. Like a cobra resting quietly beneath silk, the harem housed dozens, sometimes hundreds of women, each selected, each bound by silence. Their titles varied: great royal wife, lesser wives, concubines, singers' attendants, Some were daughters of noblemen, others diplomatic gifts, princesses from Syria, Mitanni Hatti, sent across deserts like love letters written in flesh. Inside, they formed a hierarchy so intricate even the scribes gave up trying to diagram it. The great wife ruled in name, but her power was constantly contested by those younger, more fertile, more favored, or simply better at the games of quiet manipulation. Because here, affection was currency, attention was power, and jealousy was inevitable. Every smile between women was a negotiation, every gift a weapon. Some women bore sons and held their heads a little higher. Others had daughters and learned to walk more softly. A few bore nothing at all and learned to disappear. But do not confuse this with cruelty. Most days were filled with rituals of beauty and boredom. There were baths in rosewater and milk, henna applied in lazy spirals across palms and feet, lessons in poetry music and the art of delicate conversation. They played board games designed to mimic seduction. A roll of the dice could mean conquest or rejection. They embroidered verses from love poems into veils. They watched one another like mirrors searching for weakness. And always the perfume jars of blue glass holding scents of cinnamon pine resin, crushed lilies applied behind ears beneath breasts, along the curve of the thigh, not for pleasure, but for ritual, for readiness. The Pharaoh did not visit often. When he did, the harems stirred like a wind through reeds. Preparation began at dawn. Bodies scrubbed hair combed into elaborate coils, robes of transparent linen chosen carefully for their softness and suggestion. Each woman hoped and feared, because attention could mean pregnancy, and pregnancy meant elevation or ruin. Among them were spies, not just for the court, but for one another. Letters were passed in scrolls tucked beneath trays of figs. Accusations of sorcery, seduction, infertility whispered in the ears of priests. Even the walls listened, yet the women endured. Because to live in the harem was to be close to the center of power. Even if you were never touched, even if your name was never spoken outside these walls. Some found comfort in each other, shared secrets, laughed quietly under moonlight when the guards looked the other way. There are records of friendships, deep codependent, sometimes so intimate that their language skirted the line between affection and longing. But mostly they waited for a glance, a summons, a child, a death. Waited for history to remember them. It rarely did. In official records, they are often nameless. Woman of the harem, concubine, foreign princess unclaimed, and yet they shaped dynasties, raised future kings, or killed them. Behind every powerful man in Egypt was a room full of women watching each other and the door. It began with a letter, not the kind sealed in wax and carried by couriers, but something subtler, a whisper passed through corridors, a suggestion murmured in the ear of a merchant's wife, a priest's sister, a governor's daughter. She has the look, someone would say. And from that moment, her world shifted. The girls chosen for the royal harem were not always noble. Some came from powerful households, others from distant villages where the Nile bent like a wrist in prayer. All were young. Most had never spoken to a man who did not share their blood. Their names were recorded in long scrolls folded into government annals, cataloged with dry precision. Daughter of Sefket of Thebes. Almond eyes. Good teeth. Sent from the house of Akkadian envoy. Age 14. Unmarried. Offered by temple as tribute to the divine throne. Offered. Not invited. The selection was always ceremonial, though it masqueraded as routine. They arrived by bark-slender boats carved with lotus motifs, drifting quietly down the Nile under the weight of mothers' prayers and girls' confusion. Their hair was braided for the last time by trembling fingers. Their feet were washed, not in joy, but in resignation. At the palace gates, no one cried. Crying was inappropriate. Inside, they were met not by fanfare, but by ritual. An older woman, usually a former concubine now past favor, but still powerful, would greet them, not with warmth, but with evaluation. Eyes scanning posture, poise, compliance. They were stripped of their outer clothes, their hometown accents, their former names, given new linen, given new perfume, given new silence. The baths were sacred. Long, marble pools of still water filled with crushed lotus petals and milk warmed by sunlight and incense. Each girl was bathed by temple servants not out of care, but purification. Oil was poured in slow arcs over their shoulders. Scented resins were pressed into their wrists. Their skin, hair, and breath were transformed into offerings. They were taught to walk slowly, to smile softly, to speak only when addressed, not because they were shy, but because that was the language of desirability. A tilt of the head could secure a future. A clumsy step might relegate you to the shadows forever. The high priestess would enter last bearing incense and the authority of centuries. She would walk in a circle around the chosen ones, chanting ancient hymns. Sometimes she would touch one girl lightly on the cheek and continue. No one ever knew what that meant. After the ceremony, each girl was led alone to a private chamber, not to rest, but to wait, for instructions, for fate, for a life that was no longer hers to shape. In a brittle fragment of a harem scroll, one girl once etched a line onto her wooden comb. I was not asked. I was arranged. Some never saw the Pharaoh. Some became favorites. Most became something in between, decorative, obedient, woven into the palace tapestry, like threads that shimmer only when the light hits them just right. And yet, even in the silence, even in the submission, they remembered the day they were chosen, or perhaps the day they were taken. Because in Egypt, selection was not seduction. It was surrender, wrapped in gold, bathed in oil, and blessed by those who'd long forgotten what it meant to choose. The palace harem was not built on love. It was built on strategy. Behind each embroidered veil, a treaty. Behind every arranged touch, a transaction. From afar, it seemed romantic, the great king surrounded by dozens of beautiful women, drifting through sun-dappled courtyards in sheer linen and floral perfume. But beauty here was incidental. What truly mattered was politics. Many of the women were foreign-born, daughters of kings from Syria, Nubia, Babylon, wrapped in silks and sent across the desert like living scrolls of diplomacy. These weren't gifts, they were bargains. You want Egypt's grain? Send your daughter. You want peace with the Pharaoh? Send your daughter. You want your border spared during the next campaign season? Send your daughter. And so, they came on palanquins, on camels, on long river journeys under the blaze of foreign suns. Some were 16, others barely 12. All carried the weight of nations on their narrow shoulders. The moment they entered the harem, they ceased to be daughters. They became representatives. Each word they spoke, each gesture they made was recorded in whispers. Was she respectful? Did she bow too low or not low enough? Did she ask for a translator too quickly? There were rules. Some were explicit. No political messages embroidered into garments. No contact with envoys after arrival. no prayers in foreign languages. Others were felt, like cold water, poured slowly down the spine. Within these walls, women spoke a language older than speech. A lifted eyebrow meant rivalry. A held glance meant challenge. Averted eyes, wisdom. They could not declare war, but they could provoke one with a smile. Jealousy was inevitable. Imagine being one of dozens, all trained to please all, waiting for the same man's glance. Some were clever with music. Others painted danced composed verse. A few simply knew how to listen without appearing eager. But beneath all the performances, each woman knew she was also a chess piece, moved, sacrificed, or crowned queen at the whim of a king who might never even remember her name. Sometimes foreign wives were elevated, given lavish quarters, gifts, influence. Sometimes they were locked away in obscure wings of the palace, forgotten once their political usefulness expired. And sometimes, just sometimes, a woman learned to play the game better than the men who created it. There is a letter written in Akkadian from a foreign princess to her father, found tucked in a clay tablet archive near Amarna. I am well. I eat. I am bathed. But no one speaks my name. They call me the treaty bride. Tell my sisters to smile when the priests arrive. The great wife often bore the brunt of these politics. She had to accept the foreign women with grace, host them at formal ceremonies, pretend not to notice the ones who grew round with child, because in Egypt, status was less about affection and more about fertility. The one who bore a son was no longer a diplomatic token. She became dangerous. So the palace with its flowers and fountains became a battlefield. Silent, scented, sacred. And as the incense burned and the linen fluttered in the breeze, the women waited to be noticed, to be favored, to be remembered not as daughters of treaties, but as queens of their own making. In a palace where hundreds of women whispered and waited, only one sat beside the throne. She was not the youngest, not always the most beautiful, but she was the great royal wife, the one whose name was carved in stone, not just murmured in sheets. To be the great wife was not to be the favorite. It was to be the foundation. Her body, her womb, her silence, these were the hinges on which the doors of dynasty swung open or slammed shut. She held many titles: mistress of the two lands, mother of the air, high priestess of Hathor, lady of grace, wisdom, and divine proportion. But behind the veils of ceremony, she was a woman with a singular, inescapable role to bear sons, and to do it quickly. Fertility was her crown, conception her coronation. If she bore a healthy male child, she was immortalized in reliefs, one hand touching her swollen belly, the other raised in prayer. If she failed, her name might be quietly scratched from temple walls, her image replaced by another's. Because the great wife was not just a woman. She was a symbol, a walking contract between the gods and the people. Her successful pregnancy meant that the Pharaoh had pleased the divine. Her barrenness meant he hadn't. Behind palace doors, midwives hovered like ghosts. They examined linen for stains, charted moons, burned herbs under her bed. Sometimes the great wife swallowed charms etched with spells. Other times, she knelt beneath full moons, chanting to Hathor with bare feet and open palms. And always, always, she was watched. But she was more than a womb. As great wife, she presided over festivals, poured libations to the gods, received foreign dignitaries when the Pharaoh was away at war. In ceremonies, she walked 3 steps behind him, not as a lesser, but as balance. the female to his male, the moon to his sun, the yin of Ma'at, that sacred equilibrium Egypt worshipped like breath. Yet within the harem, she was both envied and targeted. You see, power does not sleep soundly, especially not when it wears perfume and bleeds monthly. The other women, concubines, sisters, princesses, watched her with painted eyes. If she faltered, if she grew thin, pale, weepy, someone would be waiting, smiling, fertile. In one fragmentary relief, now damaged by time and sand, the great wife is shown holding a lotus. Beneath it, a line reads, "She holds the blossom, but not its scent." What that meant, no one knows for certain. But it is suggestive. Some great wives ruled quietly, others fiercely. A few, like Ta Nefertari or Ahmose Nefertari, were so powerful that they advised their husbands, commissioned temples, and even acted as regents for their sons. Their portraits show them tall, confident, with straight spines and knowing gazes. But their letters, when found, are softer, filled with requests for healing statues, prayers for protection, instructions for how to please the gods during childbirth. Even queens, it seems, prayed not to bleed too long, not to miscarry, not to be replaced. To be the great wife was to walk a narrow corridor, adored but replaceable, sacred but scrutinized, elevated but alone. She ate from golden plates, slept in scented chambers, spoke to kings and gods. But some nights when the wind curled against her ivory window lattice and the oil lamp burned low, she may have whispered her own name just to hear it spoken aloud, because in a palace filled with worship, there was often very little love. It was not called a wedding, not in the way we know it. No vows, no rings, no dance beneath flowered arches. In Egypt, the union of the Pharaoh and his chosen bride was a reenactment, a sacred performance, a myth written in flesh. The gods had done it first, Osiris and Isis, divine siblings, divine lovers. And now mortals would follow step for step, breath for breath. The preparations began days in advance. Priests read omens in the entrails of sacrificial birds. The bride fasted, then bathed in milk, scented with rose and cedar. Her skin was rubbed with oils believed to open the womb and calm the heart. Old prayers were whispered into her earrings so the words would rest against her skin. She wore linen spun so thin it might have been made from moonlight. No color, no jewelry, no paint, just softness and stillness. The bed was ceremonial, not the marital bed of future nights, but one carved specifically for this ritual, with legs shaped like lions, the headboard inlaid with lapis and obsidian. At its center, a folded piece of embroidered linen, fresh, white, sacred. It was known quietly as the sheet of witness. The chamber was not private, not entirely. A priest stood outside the door, chanting verses from the Book of the Heavenly Union. His voice rose and fell, like the Nile itself, slow, inevitable, solemn. Inside, incense curled into the air, Kefi smoke laced with frankincense, myrrh, honey, and wine. The walls were painted with stars. The floor was covered in reeds. The ceiling opened just enough to reveal a patch of night sky, because the gods, of course, had to watch. The pharaoh would enter in silence, not as a husband, but as Osiris reborn. And she, waiting, would play her part, Isis, queen, and sister womb of resurrection, vessel of dynastic hope. They would not speak. There were no love words, only breath and movement and the memory of myth being replayed again. Their union was not expected to be passionate. It was expected to be productive. The goal was conception, a sign, a symbol, a son. If not this night, then soon. But this night, would be watched. After the priest would enter and collect the sacred linen. If stained, it was burned with prayers. If untouched, it was quietly replaced, and the ritual repeated another night with different incense, different hymns, and perhaps a different girl. The new wife would be led to the house of healing the next morning. Not because she was broken, but because this was protocol to bathe, to bleed, to be blessed. Attendants would paint her eyes with kohl and draw protective knots of Isis on her belly. Midwives would feed her dates and fig symbols of fertility, and everyone would wait for signs of fullness, for delayed moons, for the stirrings of royal life beneath her ribs. If she conceived, temples would celebrate, offerings made, names whispered to the gods before they were whispered to courtiers. If she did not, they would pretend not to notice. This was the wedding night. Not a moment of joy, but of obligation. Not two lovers discovering each other, but two roles being played for the sake of eternity. They did not need to love. They needed to continue, and when the door closed, and the smoke settled, and the stars above turned their eyes away, the palace returned to its quiet breathing, as if nothing had happened. And everything had. Not all rituals were quiet. Not all holiness was solemn. There were nights in ancient Egypt when the temples pulsed with drums, when dancers shimmered beneath oil lamps, and sacred things, very sacred things, were whispered not in temples, but in rhythm, sweat, and song. These were the festivals of the body, not in secret, not in shame, but open, divine, ordained by the calendar itself, because the gods too were sensual. They loved, they longed, and they lusted. The most infamous of these was the festival of Mini. Min, the god of fertility and masculine potency, was not subtle. His statues were carved with exaggerated anatomy, his processions loud, his rituals undeniable. In Thebes, during the height of the harvest season, young priests carried his image through the streets, a golden figure, hand raised in benediction, and beneath his kilt. Nothing was hidden. Crowds cheered. Women ululated. Men offered lettuce, a symbol of arousal and tribute. But this wasn't vulgar, not in the way we might imagine. This was a prayer, a celebration of creation, of renewal, of vitality. Because in a land where rain barely kissed the earth, fertility was life, and life had to be invoked. In temple courtyards, dancers moved like water, their bodies painted with red ochre anklets, jangling softly with every sway. They spun in spirals, lifting linen skirts to the beat of sistrums, sacred rattles, said to call the attention of Hathor herself. Some bared their breasts. Some sang songs too old for translation, but heavy with meaning. Their movements were offerings, each gesture a symbol, a wish, a breathless request to the gods. Bring rain, bring grain, bring children. Even priests participated not in abandon, but in precision. Erotic hymns were read aloud in cadence detailing divine unions between gods and goddesses, between sky and earth, between life and afterlife. These were cosmic couplings, not just desire, but balance. Not just pleasure, but prophecy. In one hymn, to Hathor, goddess of love, the verses say, "She dances at the edge of heaven, her nipples tipped with starlight, her hips singing the language of the flood." The words were sung under full moons, accompanied by flutes, drums, and the steady throb of distant fires. Sometimes the Pharaoh himself appeared. He would stand atop the temple steps, a living god among mortals, and accept tributes of wine flowers, perfume, and suggestion. His presence was both blessing and performance. The strength of his body, the ease of his movements, the glow of his skin beneath the torchlight, all became metaphors for the health of the nation. If he smiled, the people cheered. If he raised his cup, they drank. If he danced, they wept. Because the gods had entered the flesh, and then as suddenly as it began, the night would end. The dancers would retreat. The music would fall silent. The statues would be veiled again. And all that remained was the scent of incense and footprints in the sand. In the morning, scribes recorded the rituals as if they were mathematics, never quite capturing the shimmer, the heat, the pulse. Because what happened beneath the moon in music was not meant to be remembered exactly. It was meant to linger, like a kiss, like a prayer, like the echo of bare feet on cold temple stone. There comes a moment in every long rain, in every tired sun, when even a god must prove he is still divine. In ancient Egypt, that moment was called the Sed Festival, held after 30 years on the throne, and then every 3 years after it was not a celebration of rule, but a test of it. The Sed Festival was no feast of comfort. It was a ritual of rebirth. The Pharaoh was not honored. He was examined. The days leading up to it were thick with ceremony. Temples were purified, scrolls unrolled. Old hymns reserved only for this occasion were practiced until their notes bled into dreams. The entire palace turned toward one man, not to worship, but to watch. The day began in silence. At sunrise, the Pharaoh emerged from seclusion, his limbs rubbed with oil, his body cloaked in white. He did not smile. This was not theater. This was ritual survival. First came the run of the king, a circuit symbolic but real around a sacred track built beside the temple. It was meant to prove that he still possessed the vitality to rule. Old kings limped. Young kings soared. Some stumbled. All were watched. The priests lined the track with their scrolls, ready to reinterpret the meaning of a faltering step. Then came the dual coronation. Wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, the Pharaoh had to sit, stand, kneel, and speak in perfect rhythm, embodying the harmony of the two lands. Every gesture was rehearsed. Every syllable was sacred. A slip of the tongue could be taken as an omen, a pause as weakness. He was then presented to statues of the gods, who sat in shrines behind gauze screens, as if they too preferred to remain partially hidden during judgment. The Pharaoh recited the 14 declarations of renewal, calling on Ra-Ptah, Horus Isis, and Ma'at to witness his worth. His hands trembled, or perhaps the wind moved the linen. No one ever said for certain. At nightfall, the most secret ritual began. It was never written down, only whispered from king to king, priest to priest. Some say it involved a symbolic union with a sacred consort chosen for her purity, her symmetry, her closeness to the divine feminine. Others claim the Pharaoh entered a chamber alone, stood before a mirror of polished obsidian, and faced the image of his own mortality. We don't know. We're not meant to. The walls of that chamber were sworn to silence, and silence kept its vow. What we do know, the next morning, he emerged wearing new regalia. His sandals were different, his crown freshly bound, his robe cut from cloth dyed in ochre lapis and bone ash, the colors of resurrection. And the people cheered, because their God King had passed. He had bled and breathed and endured. He had been tested, and he had returned In one tablet fragment, a scribe recorded, "He ran though his legs were weak. He stood, though the sun burned him. He ruled again, and the gods bowed." But it wasn't always so triumphant. Some pharaohs delayed their first said festival. Some never made it that far. Others collapsed during the ritual and were quickly retired behind heavy doors and polished masks. Because Egypt could forgive many things, but not a king who could not run, the said festival was not merely tradition. It was a reminder that even gods had to earn their divinity. Again, and again, and again. And if they failed, well, stone remembers silence better than scandal. Long before parchment bore royal decrees, before temples echoed with prayers carved in stone, there were poems. Whispered, sung, written in ink that bled like soft wine into reeds. They called them songs of the body, not scandalous, not obscene, but sacred, slow, and full of metaphor, because in Egypt to speak of love too plainly was to bruise its magic. A woman might say, "My desire is a field of barley at flood. He is the breeze that opens my petals." And the meaning was clear but clothed in fragrance. These poems were composed by palace scribes, priestesses, dancers, even lovers whose names were never recorded. They survived on broken pottery shards, graffiti on garden walls, and the inner folds of burial shrouds. Words hidden close to the skin, because sometimes the most human things need to hide in order to live. Their voices drift softly through time. From a woman to her lover, my heart flutters hastily when I think of your love. It lets me not act sensibly. It leaps from its place. From a man watching a girl draw water, the glimpse of your wrist beneath your bracelet makes my knees forget the ground. These were not epic poems. No battles, no politics, just touches remembered. The smell of someone's hair in spring, the curve of a smile in the heat, the ache of waiting. They described kisses as fruit splitting under the sun, laughter as perfume spilled over alabaster. Desire was honey, breath wind, hands lotus petals unfolding one by one. Some poems were left unfinished, as if the poet had fallen asleep mid-thought, or stopped writing because the memory became too much. One broken verse reads, when he, and then nothing. A fragment, a ghost, a sigh pressed into time. Erotic poetry in Egypt was not just private, it was also ritual. During festivals of love, priestesses sang them in temple gardens. New brides recited them while being bathed before their wedding nights. Some were etched into the walls of tombs, not as sin, but as continuation. A wish to carry longing into the afterlife, to feel lips again in eternity. To be remembered not as a statue, but as someone who once waited, once burned, once reached for another in the dark. Even pharaohs wrote, or more likely dictated. There is a poem believed to be written for a great wife, perhaps Nefertari, perhaps someone long forgotten. It reads, "Your voice is my harp string, your fingers the stars I count at night. Come to me when the papyrus sways, and I will know it is you. No decree, no crown, just longing. Even gods, it seems, grew soft at twilight." And so, these songs survived not in libraries, but in hearts, in secret smiles, in nighttime scribbles, in the way someone might pause even now when reading a line that feels too close. The Nile flooded, empires rose, kings were buried, but the words remained, and still they sing. Desire in ancient Egypt was not left to chance. It was measured, monitored, managed. A man's failure to perform, a woman's inability to conceive, these were not merely personal sorrows. They were cosmic imbalances. A pharaoh's virility determined the fertility of the soil. A queen's womb mirrored the pulse of the Nile. So when pleasure failed, when conception faltered, they turned not to confession, but to medicine. And Egypt had many. Goose fat, warmed over fire, rubbed along the spine to awaken the life wind. Figs soaked in beer, sweet fermented, and mashed into thick pastes to be eaten at sunset with prayers to Hathor. Ground lotus seed mixed with honey, shaped into small ivory-colored pellets, and swallowed before the wedding bed. Each cure whispered with belief. Each remedy layered in ritual, but this was not superstition. It was pharmacology disguised in myth. Ancient physicians at Swing kept scrolls of formulas tucked in reed baskets, some practical, some poetic. One recipe reads, to restore a man's longing, crush garlic, stir with milk from a white cow, and pour over the thigh. Speak the name of the beloved thrice before drinking. Another for women, to welcome the child, place coriander beneath the tongue and sleep facing the full moon. Let the wind pass over you. Do not speak until morning. Midwives, too, were alchemists in their own way. With polished bronze mirrors and sharp ears, they sensed when failure came from fear, not from the flesh. Some women trembled, some flinched, some simply wept in silence. And so the midwives told stories, braided hair, with calming chants, tied knots of Isis beneath the pillow to loosen the spirit's grip. Because sometimes desire had to be coaxed back into the body like a frightened bird. In the royal palace, the line between doctor and priest was nearly invisible. A failed night between the king and his chosen consort might be followed by smoke, by the low hum of invocations, by warm oil poured down the spine as sacred hymns danced across bare skin. Not passion, but prescription. And when all else failed, when conception did not come, when the Pharaoh's breath grew short, when hands did not tremble with want, they turned to statues. Small carved talismans. Bes, the dwarf god of protection and fertility, with his lion face and stubby legs, was placed beside the bed to chase away cold spirits. His image smiled, but his gaze was fierce. There is one papyrus fragment that speaks with quiet exhaustion. He is strong in the day, but the night defeats him. I have lit every candle. Still, the child does not arrive. Not a failure of effort, but a fading of hope. Desire, like a river, can dry slowly. And sometimes, no fig or prayer can bring back the flood. But still, they tried. Because in Egypt, even longing was sacred. Even silence was something to treat. And if the gods had withdrawn their favor, then perhaps the right herb, the right gesture, the right word might coax them close again. So each night beneath veils and linen, the palace prepared its remedies. And love, or something like it, was swallowed like medicine. Bitter, honeyed, holy. Not all medicine was swallowed. Not all healing was touched. Some of it was worn hidden in the hem of a robe, tucked beneath a breast, or tied gently around a trembling wrist. These were the tools of the charm makers and the domain of the spell women. They did not live in palaces. Most dwelled near the edge of town, where the dust settled thick and the cats listened more than the people. But their names traveled through corridors like secrets. In ancient Egypt, the line between magic and medicine was not sharp. It was silk, thin, strong, and quietly woven through daily life, especially when it came to the body, to lust, fertility, pleasure, power. for women of the harem for brides, preparing their beds for pharaohs who feared impotence more than war. These women were summoned quietly. They arrived not with scrolls, but with bundles wrapped in reed mats, tied with dyed string smelling faintly of clove and river silt. Inside beads, bones, knots, feathers, ash, hair, a strange inventory, and yet each item knew its place. One common charm was the image of Bes, the squat, lion-faced protector of childbirth and passion. Women wore him carved in carnelian or ivory strapped around the thigh or hidden beneath the navel. He was grotesque to look at, tongue out, eyes bulging, stubby legs ready to dance, but that was the point. His ugliness frightened away evil, and the gods respected that kind of honesty. Another charm, the knot of Isis. Shaped like an ankh, but bound like a sash, it was placed beneath the bed, or worn beneath the left breast. It represented protection blood, and binding, a way to hold the body together, even when the heart was fraying. Sometimes the knot was tied during a spell spoken in soft breath. As the river winds, so let his desire return. As the lotus opens, so let her womb be known. The words mattered less than the intention, and the whispering, always the whispering. Some spell women embroidered names into thread. Others wrapped herbs inside linen and buried them beneath thresholds. A few mixed oils that smelled of resin and rosewood, meant to be dabbed behind the knees before walking into a room where power needed to bend. The harem women knew them by name, or by scent, or by silence. They paid in gold, but more often in stories. Make him remember me. Make her forget I ever lived. Let the child be mine, even if no one knows. And the spell women nodded, never judging, only listening, only weaving. One surviving charm was found in a tomb near Memphis. Tied with red thread and sealed in a hollow shell, it bore an inscription: to silence his anger, to stir his hunger, to protect my name. The charm was buried between the ribs, placed there by someone who once loved or feared or both. Even pharaohs, they say, consulted the charm makers. Not openly, but when desire waned, or dreams turned restless, or wives whispered of empty wombs, the priests would send a messenger to the edge of the city. And by morning, a small pouch would arrive. No instructions, just belief. In a world where gods demanded performance, where pleasure was duty and longing was law, these women offered something gentler: protection, power, and the promise that someone somewhere still believed in magic, even if no one else did. Not all love in the palace was soft. Not all longing led to pleasure. Sometimes it led to murder. Behind the lattice windows of the harem, in the silence between incense prayers and ivory combs, grew something that could not be perfumed or painted over resentment. It began, as it often does, with waiting. Waiting to be touched. Waiting to be chosen. Waiting for a future that refused to arrive. And in that endless waiting, some women began to imagine other outcomes. The harem was not a home. It was a gilded trap where dozens of women circled one man like petals around a closed bud. Not all would bloom. And the ones who did not, especially those who had once tasted favor, who had once been called beloved, could become something else. Not bitter, not cruel, just dangerous. The most infamous tale is known simply as the harem conspiracy. It happened during the long waning reign of Ramses III, a pharaoh worn by decades of rule, with many wives, many sons, and perhaps too many secrets. His great wife was safe. But one of his lesser wives, Tia, had a different plan. Her son Pentaur was not heir, not favored. not crowned, but Tia believed he should be. And belief in a harem was sometimes more potent than blood. The plan unfolded like shadow. A network of conspirators, harem women court officials, even palace guards gathered beneath the veil of routine. Letters were smuggled in perfume jars. Orders whispered in the language of hairdressers and midwives. They plotted not just to assassinate the pharaoh, but to replace him with TA's son. To swap gods like slipping one ring off a finger and placing another. We know this not from rumor, but from trial records etched on papyrus found in a tomb near Medinet Habu. They list over 40 names, including singers, scribes, gatekeepers, and spellwomen who crafted poisons disguised as love charms. One woman was accused of using wax figurines to cast harmful magic. Another confessed to reciting words of flame into the king's food. And Tia Shi said nothing. But her eyes, one scribe recorded, did not look afraid. The attempt failed, or partially succeeded. Ramses III may have died. The body discovered much later bears a deep wound across the throat, a slice no embalmer could hide. His son Pentower was found guilty, but instead of execution, he was given the choice of honorable suicide. A boy of 19, made to die for ambition that wasn't even fully his. His body was found in a plain linen shroud, mouth agape, twisted as if still protesting. They call it the screaming mummy, and TA history forgets what became of her. Perhaps she was executed, perhaps exiled, perhaps, and this seems most Egyptian of all, she was quietly erased. Not with blood, but with silence. Her name scratched from walls, her images chiseled off reliefs, as if she had never been there to begin with. But the harem remembered. The women remembered, because TA had dared to do what so many only imagined, to turn waiting into action, to turn dismissal into vengeance. She had loved. But love denied too long can become a blade. In the margins of one later scroll, a priest scribbled a warning. Do not give many wives if you give them little power. A flower bruised too often will turn to thorns. The harem, after the conspiracy, changed. More guards, more surveillance, fewer names remembered, but the lessons remained, spoken in the hush between perfume and prayers, that even in a palace built for desire, the most dangerous passion was ambition. The harem was a garden, but not every flower was meant to bloom in sunlight. Many children were born within its walls, some from love, some from duty, some from chance. Tiny fingers wrapped around royal bloodlines. Tiny hearts beat with the weight of succession and secrecy. But not all of them were wanted. Not all were named. And not all survived. The sons of the great wife were celebrated, their births announced with hymns and offerings. Statues, carved nurses, appointed omens recorded. They were potential heirs, reflections of their father, gods in waiting. But the others, those born to lesser wives, concubines or foreign brides, they were a different kind of child. Quiet children raised in a palace full of rules, but not recognition. Some were acknowledged, given minor titles: royal son, son of the body overseer of horses, sent to distant provinces to serve, to govern, to exist, just far enough away. Others remained unnamed, in records their lineage whispered, but never written. Because in a world ruled by succession, too many sons could become a threat, and the daughters, they were even more shadowed. Many were married off before their first moon's blood, to generals, nobles, governors, or even their own half-brothers. Some were offered to temples, raised as priestesses of Hathor or Isis, living lives wrapped in silence and incense, and some simply disappeared into the corridors of the palace, becoming attendants, singers, or shadows. Their names were not carved, their stories not sung, but they were there. Imagine a child growing up among the scented halls of the harem, his mother telling him, "Hush now. Do not speak too loudly. The walls have ears." Or a daughter barely tall enough to reach the water basin being taught not to dream beyond the threshold of her chamber, because dreaming was dangerous and lineage could be a curse. Some harem children never met their fathers. The Pharaoh, encircled by gods and guards, rarely had time to know all those who carried his blood. And so, they were raised by nursemaids, by eunuchs, by old concubines who knew the rhythms of palace survival. They learned to read, to walk gracefully, to bow with just the right blend of deference and possibility. They waited for letters, for summons, for names to be spoken aloud. Many waited forever, and yet they played. They laughed. They climbed fig trees in forbidden gardens. They splashed in the fountain basins when the attendants weren't watching. They sang songs with broken lyrics and braided each other's hair with shells. They were children, even as the walls pressed in. In one rare ivory comb, found in the tomb of a noblewoman, there is a carving of two children, a boy with a shaved head, a girl with a lotus tucked behind her ear. They are smiling, looking at one another, as if they knew something we don't. Their names were never inscribed, but someone at least remembered their faces. You see, Egypt remembered its kings, its battles, its gods. But the children born behind embroidered curtains, whose lullabies were sung by women who were once almost queens, those children were remembered only in fragments, in a slipper left beneath a bed, in a lullaby hummed into dust, in a half-written name on the edge of a scroll. Among the many walls of ancient Egypt covered in gods, wars, harvests, and offerings, there exists one that whispers something different. A tomb in Saqqara, simple, intimate, built for two men, Khnumhotep and Nyankhnum, royal manicurists, servants of the palace, and something more. Their tomb is unlike any other. Side by side, their names are written with equal reverence. Their titles mirror one another. Their images appear not once, but dozens of times, not just together, but entwined. They touch noses, a gesture the Egyptians reserved for the most intimate closeness. Their arms encircle each other. Their fingertips graze not by accident, but with unmistakable intent. They are depicted as a couple, not hidden, not ridiculed, simply carved. The walls say nothing aloud. There is no inscription that reads lovers, no scroll that confirms the nature of their bond. But the art speaks, and it does not whisper. It lingers. In poses usually reserved for husband and wife, they sit together before offerings, walk together in gardens, receive blessings from the gods together, not as friends, as something more. This was not an isolated moment. Egyptian art and mythology leave room for fluidity, for affection beyond the structure of marriage, for intimacy that defies our categories. Gods transformed. Kings wore both crowns, upper and lower, male and female. The divine embraced ambiguity. And in this liminal space, love in all its quiet sacred forms was allowed to breathe. There are poems, faint and fragmented, that hint at male longing. He passed, and my knees forgot the ground. His scent clung to my linen. I did not wash it. And murals that show men reclining together with hands clasped not in worship, but in comfort. There is even a single ostracon, a broken pottery shard scribbled with laughter. A man complains that another stole his heart like he stole his wine. A joke, perhaps, or not. The Egyptians did not define people by how they loved. They defined them by how they lived, their roles, their contributions, their closeness to the divine. And so same-sex affection was not scandalous. It was simply unlabeled. It did not need justification. It did not need apology. It needed only space, and the walls gave it that. Khnumhotep and Nyankhnum were buried together. Their tomb, though small, endured. Thousands of years later, their images remain untouched, unedited. No one scratched them away. No one rewrote the narrative. Their story is still there in ochre and stone, in every curve of their painted hands. And maybe that's all they ever wanted. Not a proclamation, not a monument, just to be remembered together. She was not meant to rule. She was meant to support, to stand slightly behind, to bear children, to speak softly and die quietly. But Hatshepsut did none of those things. Instead, she looked at the throne and sat down. The daughter of Thutmose, Pharaoh's Hatshepsut, was born into divinity, but not into destiny. She became queen to her half-brother, Thutmose II, as was expected. She played the part, great royal wife, mother guardian of the gods. But when he died, and the boy heir was too small for the crown, Hatshepsut did something extraordinary. She didn't wait. She took the throne, not as queen regent, not as a placeholder, as Pharaoh. It was not enough to wear the title. She had to transform. She donned the false beard, the pleated kilt, the broad-shouldered silhouette of kingship carved in stone. She was depicted with a strong jaw, a flat chest, a regal stare that did not ask permission. She reshaped herself in the image of majesty. And the gods, they did not protest. Her inscriptions tell us what she wanted us to believe. I did it as Ra commanded. My father the god chose me. But beneath the divine justification, there is something more human. A quiet burning certainty. She did not apologize. She did not step aside. She ruled, and Egypt flourished. Temples rose in her name, most famously, Deir el-Bahari, a terraced marble carved into limestone cliffs like a hymn frozen in stone. Trade routes opened, art flourished, peace held, no wars of expansion, no mass graves, just silks from Punt incense from the south, and pillars etched with praise. She ruled not as a man pretending to be king, but as a woman who refused to be anything less. Of course not everyone approved. Whispers stirred behind temple doors. Priests questioned the natural order. And after her death, a slow erasure began. Her statues were smashed. Her name chiseled out of royal lists. Images of her replaced with her stepsons, Thutmose III, the boy she once raised, now grown, now bitter. History tried to forget her, but stone remembers. In the ruins of Deir el-Bahari, her image still lingers, weathered but unyielding. Eyes wide, back straight, crown high. She wears the cobra on her brow like a challenge. Was she lonely? Almost certainly. There are no records of lovers, no children of her own, no one buried beside her. She was both mother and father to a nation, and that kind of power rarely shares a bed. But she ruled for 22 years. Longer than most kings, longer than any queen. She did not conquer with swords. She conquered with presence. And in doing so, she changed what a pharaoh could be. Not just a man, not just a god, but a woman in sandals, in silence, in sovereignty. In a kingdom carved by tradition, one Pharaoh stepped away from the stone. He turned his back on the old gods, on the temples, on the endless silent rows of kings who came before him, and he reached instead for light. Akhenaten, the heretic king, the sun's only voice, the man who closed the temples and opened the windows. He didn't just change Egypt's religion, he changed its art. He changed how power was pictured, how love was shown, how flesh was honored. On the walls of his new city, Amarna, he painted not conquest, but closeness. Himself, leaning into the arms of Nefertiti, their faces nearly touching. Their daughters, usually invisible in royal art, danced barefoot at their feet, one reaching for his necklace, another nestled against her mother's hip. These scenes were not symbolic. They were specific. They showed crooked teeth, thin limbs, wrinkled skin, not perfection, presence. He worshipped not Ra, not Osiris, not Amun, but Aten the sun disk, the source of all life. And Aten gave not commandments, but light. Thin golden rays fell from the sky in the art of the time, each ending in a tiny hand touching Akhenaten, blessing him, feeding him breath. No swords, just fingers, contact. In Akhenaten's world, the divine was intimate. It kissed foreheads. It cradled babies. It brushed across cheeks like a father putting his children to sleep. His palace was filled with laughter, song's soft steps over sandstone floors. A quiet revolution painted in ochre and love, and yet, the bodies. His own image was strange. He is shown with wide hips, a belly soft, and full long neck, narrow shoulders, androgynous, uncertain unlike any pharaoh before. Some whispered he was sick. Others said he was divine in both forms, male and female creator and nurturer. In one inscription, a court poet wrote, "He gives birth to beauty with his gaze." Nefertiti, too, was unlike the queens before her. She was not background. She stood beside him, not behind. She wore the blue crown of kings. She kissed him in temple art unthinkable before, and almost never again. Together they were soft, visible, touching. Their reign was not eternal. Their city fell. Their names were nearly wiped clean. Akhenaten's successors called him mad, a traitor, an offense to the gods. But still his family remains on those crumbling walls, laughing, leaning alive. There is a fragment of a painted relief. Aten above, rays streaming down, like arms. Akhenaten and Nefertiti, sitting cross-legged, their daughter between them. The child reaches up, not for a throne, not for a crown, just for a parent's hand. In Egypt, where everything was ritual, he chose affection. And maybe that too was holy. He is the most famous of all the pharaohs. Not because of his power, not because of his reign, but because he was found. Perfectly preserved, hidden, golden, Tutankhamun, the boy king, the brittle heir of a broken dynasty. He was born into the aftermath of heresy, the child of Akhenaten, and likely his own sister. In Egypt, the blood of kings had to be pure. But purity, as it turns out, can be poison. His lineage was divine. His bones were not. He came to the throne at 9, or maybe 8. Too young to wear a crown, too young to say no. He was married early to Ankhesenamun, his half-sister, his only known queen, the girl with sad eyes in every surviving carving. They were children told to create gods. Their union was marked not by scandal, but by sorrow. In his tomb, 2 tiny coffins were found, the mummified remains of stillborn daughters. Their names never spoken, their faces never finished in paint. They were meant to be continuations. Instead, they became endings. Tutankhamun's health was fragile. He walked with a cane, or several, over 100, were found buried with him. His left foot was twisted, his spine curved. His body under all that gold was failing. CT scans revealed fractures, a crushed knee, a missing sternum, and a skull injury that still whispers, accident, or something darker. He tried to restore the old gods. He reopened temples, rebuilt what Akhenaten had torn down. He changed his name from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, a political apology etched in limestone. But apologies don't last, not in dynasties built on sand and blood. He died around 19. A flicker, a sigh, wrapped in linen and placed in a tomb too small for a king. Paint still wet on the walls, perfume still thick in the air. The world moved on, until it didn't. In 1922, they opened the door. And there he was nestled inside 3 coffins, a golden mask placed over a face that had once wept for unborn daughters. Everything around him glittered daggers, chariots, beds, sandals, games, perfumes. But beneath it all was a young man who had inherited a throne and very little else. Tutankhamun became eternal only in death. His name erased in life was resurrected by discovery. And yet, what do we truly know? Not what he believed, not what he feared. Only that his body was broken, his legacy delicate, his death too soon. He was born from the pursuit of divine blood. He died because of it. A boy made God. A God returned to dust. And now he rests not in silence, but in whispers. Every time someone says his name, he is called back. Not as a ruler, not as a warrior, but as a fragile echo in gold. History remembers queens. It sings of Nefertiti's grace, Hatshepsut's crown, Tiye's boldness. But for every named woman, 100 more moved silently behind her, unrecorded, unthanked, unseen. And yet it was their hands that dressed the queens, their breath that cooled fevered kings, their blood that washed over palace floors in childbirth and in burial. They were dancers, servants, wet nurses, perfume mixers, linen weavers, singers in temple shadows. And though no scroll says so, they made the palace breathe. The harem was filled with them. Not wives, not concubines, just women young, aging forgotten, tasked with the rhythm of royal life. They rose before dawn, ground barley into paste, combed tangled hair, sang lullabies to children who would one day become gods. They were trusted with secrets, but never offered names. We know they existed because of what they left behind. A fingerprint pressed into a jar of scented oil, still visible beneath museum glass. A broken comb, carved with lilies, discarded behind a harem wall. A small pair of sandals, adult-sized, but sewn with a trembling hand. Sometimes they appeared in art, but never in the center. Always in profile, always unnamed, one hand raised in offering, eyes, lowered skin painted the color of dusk. No inscription, just the line servant of the house. A title that could mean anything, or everything. And yet these women knew desire, grief, hope. They waited in corridors while other women were chosen. They held the hands of those in labor. They wept quietly when children died, then changed the linens and lit the incense as if nothing had happened. Some were slaves, others born to temple service. Some came willingly, most did not. They were taken from distant towns or given as tributes. Their names removed in exchange for silence, their pasts dissolved like ink in water. And yet they lived, fully. They told jokes. They had secret crushes. They carved little animals out of leftover beeswax and left them on each other's sleeping mats. One harem graffiti scratched onto the inner wall of a pantry. She sings when she thinks no one listens. I listen. No name. Just that. A record of noticing. And when they died, they were buried without statuary. No tomb inscriptions. No golden mask. Just a linen shroud, sometimes with a flower pressed to the chest. The flower outlasted the name. But still, they moved through history, like wind between columns unseen, but shaping the air. They were the women without names, and they built empires without being asked if they wanted to. They called it an alliance, a gesture of peace, a symbol of unity, a gift fit for a king. But for the girl barely past her first moon's blood, it was a one-way journey into a life that was never hers. She was a foreign bride. To marry into the Egyptian court was to disappear. Not immediately, not violently, but in pieces. First, her name softened, then changed. Rewritten to suit palace tongues, translated into symbols that never quite meant the same thing. Then her gods quietly set aside for new rituals, new incense, new prayers she did not yet understand. Then her voice. The practice was common. Syria, Hatti, Mitanni, Nubia. Daughters of kings, sent across desert and river, escorted by priests and translators carrying dowries of linen lapis horses and silence. They entered Egypt not as individuals, but as agreements, living signatures, softened threats. Upon arrival, she was dressed in linen, bathed in oils, painted with kohl, taught how to bow the Egyptian way not too low, not too long, just enough to be pleasing, just enough to be safe. And then she waited to be summoned, waited to be seen, waited to learn if she was merely a symbol or something more. Some foreign brides were favored, elevated, given quarters with gardens, their portraits painted with affection. Others were kept in the background political footnotes, traded again through their children, or quietly forgotten when their father's favor faded. And a few were imprisoned. Diplomacy soured treaties, broken the bride becoming a hostage wrapped in jewelry. We know of one such woman. Her name is lost, but her story remains etched in the letters of her father, preserved on cuneiform tablets, buried in the archives of Amarna. Why have you not written to her? She says she is alone. Has she not given you a son? The letter was never answered. Some foreign women adapted. They learned the language, bore children, lit incense, pretended their dreams still spoke in their mother's tongue. But others clung to fragments of home, a song hummed under breath, a scarf tucked beneath pillows, a whispered prayer to a goddess whose name was no longer welcome. Not all were sent unwillingly. Some believed in the stories of golden halls, sweet dates, soft nights, but reality in the palace was measured in proximity, and for most the pharaoh remained distant. They might see him once, twice, or never. Their role was fulfilled in the arrival, not the aftermath. Still some became mothers, queens, found ways to shape their small corner of the court. But most became myths, known only as the daughter of the king of X, filed under politics, not people. One broken comb found in a harem chamber bore a faint inscription. She spoke her name once each night so it would not leave her. a spell, a memory, a resistance. They were gifts, yes, wrapped in silk, laced with diplomacy. But they were also girls, with hands and hearts, and homes they never saw again. The court of the Pharaoh was not always solemn. Yes, it had its rituals, its priests, its hierarchies carved in granite. But behind the pillars, beneath the painted ceilings, there were nights of games, and not all were innocent. In the private chambers, in candlelight tinted amber by perfumed smoke, the palace played at pleasure. Board games designed for strategy, but used for seduction. Dances choreographed for festivals, repurposed for flirtation. Wine served for celebration, tilted just enough to loosen tongues and lace glances with boldness. One game was called senet, an ancient board of squares and crossing paths, played with carved tokens and flicked sticks. In public, it was a pastime. In private, it was an invitation. Pieces moved forward or back. Some said the winner was blessed by the gods, but sometimes the winner was simply allowed to lean in closer. A royal concubine might feign confusion, asking the rules again. Her voice soft, her fingers grazing the player's hand just a little too long. Not quite scandal, but close enough to be remembered. The dancers knew this language well. Their feet moved in rehearsed rhythms, but their eyes spoke volumes. A tilt of the head, a swirl of sheer linen, a hand that paused just before the hip. It was art, yes, but also strategy. Some dances were prayers, others were predictions. Even banquets dripping in gold and scent were arenas for quiet competition. Who sat closest to the Pharaoh? Who poured his wine? Who made him laugh or kept him listening after the laughter faded? These things mattered. Every gesture was a ripple, a shared fig, a compliment on a new pendant, a playful comparison between hunting falcons and difficult men. The court loved metaphor. Wine was a common accomplice. Sweet dark, spiced with date and pomegranate, served in polished alabaster cups with handles shaped like lotus stems. A concubine might offer a sip from her own vessel, not just to share flavor, but to exchange breath. To do so was bold. To refuse insulting. To hesitate, political. And behind it all, the musicians played their soft, slow songs. Instruments tuned to seduction, the lute, the harp, the sistrum rattling just enough to stir the soul. And always the scent of blue lotus, that flower of forgetting, of dreaming, of slipping into something not quite real. Some games led nowhere, just smiles traded like coins. But others shifted fates. A favored glance led to a night led to a child led to a throne. It began with laughter and ended with a dynasty. There's an inscription hidden beneath the glaze of an old wine cup. She played the game so sweetly, he forgot the rules. A joke, a truth, both. They called it court entertainment. But make no mistake, these were games of power, played with perfume poetry and pause, where losing meant nothing, but winning could mean everything. Before the Pharaoh, before the pyramids, before even the names of the gods were carved into stone, there was the Nile. It did not need temples. It did not ask for prayers. It simply returned, every year, without fail, with wet arms and open hands. And in Egypt, that return was not just natural, it was divine, erotic. The Nile was not a river. It was a body, a lover, a god. Its banks the thighs of the land, its rise a kind of slow arousal, its flooding a sacred consummation. They called it Hapi, neither fully male nor female, but both, a god with soft breasts and a rounded belly, carrying baskets of grain and bouquets of lotus. Fertile, bountiful, overflowing, the priests watch the waters like midwives, noting the color, the timing, the mood. A generous flood meant a fruitful year. Too little, and the crops would wither. Too much, and homes would drown. The river had to be courted, pleased, seduced. Rituals were held on the banks. Offerings cast into the current jewelry, wine, sweetbread perfume. Sometimes women sang to the water. Sometimes they bathed naked beneath the moon, believing the Nile would take their longing and turn it into rain. The flood was more than life. It was union. The earth lay open. The river entered, and the fields awakened. A marriage, repeated each year. Without jealousy. The Pharaoh was part of this myth too. His potency reflected in the Nile's abundance. If he was strong, the river swelled. If he was weak, it held back. In hymns, his seed was called the flood, his embrace the wet season, his passion the kiss of the river on the waiting land. Even the temples spoke in metaphor. One relief shows the Nile as a man pouring water over a goddess, reclining in reeds, her face tilted in ecstasy. Another depicts the river as a stream flowing from the loins of the Creator God himself, spilling across the land to awaken all things. A fragment of a priest's prayer survives. Come to me, O river divine. Fill my arms as you fill the valley. Let no field go untouched. Let no womb go dry. They did not blush at such words. There was no shame in longing, no discomfort in metaphor. Because to be close to the river was to be close to life. And life in Egypt was always touched by desire. Even now, when the Nile laps gently at its modern banks, it carries echoes of prayers cast like pebbles, of women who whispered to the current, of kings who watched the rising tide and wondered what it said about them. In most cultures, desire fades with death. The flesh falls away. The heart stops reaching. Longing dissolves like breath in winter air. But not in Egypt. Their love did not end with the body. It crossed over, carried in scrolls, oils linen, and in the echo of names whispered one last time. They did not bury their dead in silence. They buried them in invocation. The tombs were not merely graves. They were bedrooms, temples, theaters of memory built to continue the feelings death could not sever. On walls painted in ochre and gold, you'll find more than processions and offerings. You'll find touch, hands resting gently on shoulders, eyes gazing sideways in eternal affection, lips curved not in solemnity, but in warmth, desire carved into limestone. And then there is the myth, the one they never stopped telling, Osiris and Isis, the god torn apart by jealousy, his body scattered across the earth, his phallus lost to the river, and Isis, his wife and sister, who found each piece, all but one. So she made it, from gold and will. And with magic she brought him back long enough to create life. That life became Horus, the falcon god, the line restored. It was not just resurrection. It was the rebirth of desire. From death came the sacred union. And from union, eternity. In tombs, this story repeats. A mural in the Valley of the Kings shows Isis kneeling, wings outstretched, hovering over Osiris's body as stars spill down around them. It is not grief, it is devotion. A reminder that love, when divine, does not need breath to endure, even in the objects buried with the dead. we see the shadows of longing. Lotus buds pressed into hands, symbols of awakening. Alabaster jars of perfume, still faintly sweet. Erotic amulets placed near the thighs. Scrolls tucked beneath linen read, "May my voice reach you in the west. May my hands still know your skin. May your spirit come to me in dreams." They did not bury desire. They prepared it for the long journey. Some tombs show couples reclining together, drinking, laughing, reaching toward each other, as if time could not interrupt the moment. And perhaps it couldn't. Because in Egypt, love was part of the soul. And the soul was eternal. One small figurine was found in a worker's grave, two lovers entwined, carved from a single piece of ivory. Their faces worn smooth by time, but their posture unmistakable together. No title, no status, just union. To the Egyptians, desire was not mortal. It was divine energy. It could cross deserts. It could rise with the sun. It could follow you into the darkness and light the way forward. And so they loved not for now, but for always. The Egyptians spoke in symbols, not because they lacked language, but because they understood something deeper, that some truths are better felt than explained. And so when they wished to speak of desire, of strength, of domination, and seduction, they didn't use human words. They used animals. The bull was the most obvious. Massive, proud, relentless. The embodiment of male virility, a walking engine of divine potency. In festivals, the Apis bull, sacred and adorned with gold discs between its horns, was paraded through the streets. Not for slaughter, for worship. Its breath was divine, its gaze prophetic, its seed sacred. Pharaohs compared themselves to it. Women sang to it. And in the hush of temple shadows, the bull became a metaphor for the king's arousal. Then there was the lion, the hunter, the protector, the devourer. When carved beside a queen, it meant power. When carved beside a concubine, it meant dominance. Sekhmet, lion-headed goddess of blood and passion, was said to destroy cities in a frenzy, and then return to the gods drunk on wine disguised as blood. She was not evil. She was honest, because love, too, can be destructive, especially when ignored. The cobra was another symbol not of fear, but of penetration. It stood tall, hood flared, poised to strike. It adorned the crowns of pharaohs coiled just above the brow, like an eternal erection of warning and power. Its venom was not just death, it was transformation. To be bitten by desire, to be undone, to be reborn. Even the hippopotamus had a place in the language of lust. Taweret, the goddess of childbirth, was part hippo, part lion, part crocodile. Grotesque, yes, but deeply protective. She guarded beds, fertility, wombs. Because sex in Egypt was not just performance, it was protection. And the beasts knew how to guard what mattered. Animals were carved into beds, into mirrors, into amulets worn between the thighs. A cobra biting its own tail. A bull mounting a cow in the reeds. Lions flanking the posts of ceremonial couches. Not pornography, prayer. Not vulgarity, myth. Even in royal propaganda, pharaohs likened themselves to wild animals. I pounce like a lion on my enemies. I mount the earth like the great bull, not to shock, to assert. Because in Egypt, to rule the land was to rule the body, and the body, like the beast, answered only to instinct. One ivory comb found in a noble woman's tomb is carved with two birds locked in flight. Below them, a lioness watches, her mouth open, not roaring, panting. They understood something we often forget, that to desire is not always beautiful. Sometimes it is fierce, hungry, inevitable. Like the beast beneath the skin, like the god beneath the man. In ancient Egypt, a woman's worth could be measured in a single word: fertility, not beauty, not wisdom, not loyalty. The womb was her altar, and if it remained empty, she became invisible. There were words for it: nun kind, she who waits, she who bleeds too often, she who is quiet in the moon's count. No official title, no public disgrace, just absence, a daily erasure. She still wore the jewels, still attended the festivals, still smiled when others announced their pregnancies, but inside a slow drowning. Barrenness was not seen as biology. It was seen as cosmic failure. If the Pharaoh's wife did not conceive, something was wrong with her, or with the gods, or both, priests whispered. Midwives shifted their eyes. Concubines prayed a little louder, stood a little closer. Because one woman's emptiness was another's opening. There were rituals, so many. She would sleep on fertility amulets carved from faience, drink milk mixed with crushed dates and coriander, bathe in river water gathered at dawn. She would kneel beneath statues of Hathor, offer strands of her own hair, and murmur, "Make me a vessel, make me bloom." But the moon came anyway, and again, and again. Some husbands were kind. For a while, some withdrew, quietly, like petals closing. Others grew cruel, blaming, comparing, leaving the empty bed without a word. In the woman, she learned to apologize for the spaces within her. In one surviving letter from a court scribe's wife, "I have given him linens, laughter, loyalty, but I cannot give him lineage. I think he sees through me now, like glass that forgot how to shine." If she was a great wife, the stakes were higher. Barrenness could break dynasties. Without an heir, treaties meant nothing. Enemies waited. The queen might be replaced politely, but thoroughly. Her image faded from the walls. Her name removed from prayers. Not punished, just undone. Some were sent away to quiet villas by the river, to temples cloaked in incense, to shadows. Others remained, but learned to stand behind the fertile ones, to bless the children they didn't bear, to smile as they broke. But a few found other ways to mother. They raised the children of other wives, taught them to read, braided their hair, told them stories at night and prayers in the morning. And in that tenderness, there was something sacred, something that could not be measured by blood alone. Still, each time a woman bled, she remembered that to be whole in this world was to be filled, and she was not. And yet, in tombs of noble women with no children, there are still offerings: perfume, bread, letters. Someone remembered them. Someone wept. Because in the end, a womb may be empty, but a life never truly is. In the palaces of ancient Egypt, bodies could be counted, traded, gifted. A woman's worth was not in her name, but in her function: to warm a bed, to bear a son, to smile even when the silence around her grew louder than the gold at her throat. She was not seen as a soul. She was seen as a legacy machine. Her body did not belong to her. It belonged to the Pharaoh, to the dynasty, to the gods. Her womb was watched, measured by calendars and midwives and priestly calculations. Her breasts were offered in paintings, symbols of nourishment. her thighs inscribed with protective spells, not to shield her, but the child she might carry. Even in sculpture, she was often shown smaller kneeling eyes tilted upward as if carved into submission. When she walked the palace halls, people did not greet her by name. They called her the one who bore the child, the vessel of the blood, she of the quiet gaze. Beautiful, perhaps, but nameless. And yet, when she died, the world shifted. Her body, once passed from room to room, was now handled with reverence. She was washed in cedar oil, wrapped in linen, folded hundreds of times, not just to preserve, but to honor. Amulets were tucked against her skin, a scarab pressed into her chest to protect her heart from judgment. She was no longer property. She was memory. In tomb inscriptions, sometimes all that remains is a line. She lived in the house of the king. She bore one who sat on the throne. She was beloved, beloved by whom no one says. But someone carved the word anyway. Stone forgets names. Papyrus fades, but blood remembers. And so even if her name is lost, her children's children still ruled, still prayed, still passed on the dynasty she helped build. Her pain unspoken, her joy undocumented, but her echo never truly left the palace. Archaeologists find skeletons with pierced ears, faint traces of coal on cheekbones, resin clinging to hip bones like old perfume. Sometimes there is jewelry buried with her, a single ring, a tiny comb, a bead bracelet made by a child's hand. Not treasure, just evidence that someone once looked at her and saw more than property. In museums today, her face might sit behind glass, still, unblinking. People pass, whisper point, but they do not know that she once laughed into the crook of a lover's neck, that she once cried when the child would not come, that she once touched the hem of the king's robe and felt for a moment seen. She was owned, but she was also remembered, not in full, not in fairness, but enough. Enough to know she was here. Step into the tomb, and you'll find it's never quite silent. The air is thick with memory. The walls, though, still whisper. Not with words, but with images. Subtle, tender, full of meanings just beneath the paint. Erotic, yes, but never vulgar. Because in Egypt, even desire had to be coded. There are no naked embraces, no bodies sprawled in pleasure. Instead, doves. Two of them, perched together on a single branch, beaks touching. They are not named, but the placement says enough. Or you might find a pair of lotus blossoms, one open, one still curled, placed in the hand of a man offering it to a woman who glances back with half-lidded eyes. No inscription, just silence. But the longing is unmistakable. Love was never painted directly. It was implied, in the tilt of the head, in fingers reaching without quite touching, in fruit bowls so lush they feel almost indecent. A fig split open, pomegranate seeds tumbling from a broken rind, jars of honey untouched but glistening. Sensuality lived in metaphor, and metaphor in Egypt was everywhere. Even the gods embraced this style. Murals of Hathor, goddess of music and desire, show her reclining on a couch attendants, painting her toes, perfume floating in the air like song. She never looks directly at the viewer, but she doesn't need to. Her body language says, "You are watching. You may stay, but you may not touch." In one tomb, a woman offers a lotus to her husband. She is seated. He kneels before her. The flower isn't just a flower, it is invitation, and his posture, not dominance. devotion. Eroticism in tomb art was not for the living. It was for the afterlife. A promise that love, physical, emotional, spiritual, would continue. That the kiss not given in life would be returned in the field of reeds. That the body once still would stir again, would feel again, would remember. Sometimes the intimacy is barely noticeable. A woman resting her hand on a man's knee. Two figures standing so close their shadows touch before they do. And sometimes a single line of poetry carved near the base of the wall. May we walk together beneath the sycamores, our fingers tangled like vines. No one wrote, "I want you." No one needed to, because the walls themselves blushed, not from what was shown, but from what was left just barely hidden. In these tombs, desire lingers not in skin, but in gesture. And in that restraint, there is something beautiful, something ancient, something eternal, something still breathing in the dust. We have walked through chambers, veiled in incense, listened to footsteps fall soft on alabaster floors, and lingered in the hush between silk curtains and whispered names. We have seen power, dressed as ritual, desire disguised as prayer, love painted into corners of tombs where even the gods dared not look too long. And now, we come to the end, not of the story, just of the telling. Because Egypt, even when it slept, never stopped remembering. The pharaohs were gods on earth. That is what they told us. That is what we carved. But beneath the gold masks, beneath the painted eyes, beneath the crowns, forged from myth and metal, they aged, they ached, they hoped. They were worshipped, but they were lonely. In the long hours between duty and ceremony, beneath embroidered sheets and walls that did not forget, they too wondered, will I be remembered for who I was, or only for what I was supposed to be? They were kissed by priestesses, blessed by gods, touched by women who could never speak their names aloud. And still, some nights, they trembled, not in fear, but in fatigue. Even gods, when crowned too young, desired peace more than power. Even gods, when praised too long, forgot what their own voice sounded like. And when they died, their bodies oiled, wrapped, praised, their hearts weighed against feathers they left behind, not just kingdoms, but quiet. A stillness so vast it could only be filled by stories. Now the temples are silent. The river runs past fallen pillars. The gods are quiet, and the gold has dulled. But the air still holds something, a whisper, a name, a sigh that might once have been a lullaby. So sleep now. Let the incense fade. Let the linen cool. Let the torches dim on these painted walls. And as you drift, know this, the sacred body of the Pharaoh is dust. But his secrets, those strange, intimate, ritual-bound truths, still hum beneath the sand, waiting, not to be worshipped, just to be heard. The end.